Greetings. Our grandson's grandmother on the other side of the family had built a quilt for his older brother for when he received his Eagle Scout award. She had started a quilt for him but was unable to finish it. His mother asked us if we would finish that quilt for him for his Eagle Scout award, and we said yes. His mother gathered up the materials for his Eagle Scout quilt and gave them to us along with the quilt that his grandmother had made for his older brother. With these, we were supposed to come up with a plan for a quilt for our grandson. This is the older brother's quilt. His grandmother had entered this quilt into the County Quilters Guild and had won second place with it. These are the materials that we had. They're all from the Riley Blake Modern Scouting pattern. We had some 10-inch blocks, some 5-inch blocks, and 2 jelly rolls. We had some patriotic yardage that we would be able to use to cut more blocks from. Our task was to try and figure out what that quilt would look like. There were no plans, but we did have the older brother's quilt, so we consulted with all parties involved and came up with a plan. This is the layout of the finished quilt. The first thing that we did was to lay out the quilt on paper with measurements. We broke the quilt into 2 sections. This is the inner section that has a large Cougar panel. We calculated all of the materials needed, and we used this to create a cut list and determined the materials that we needed to buy. We created a shopping list of the materials needed and went shopping for material. Once we had the materials, we began the fun part of laying out the blocks to make an arrangement of the materials the way we wanted them. We used the floor as our storyboard and lay the parts out so that they will be in the arrangement that we want. At this point that we have them arranged like we want, it's time to figure out how to sew these parts together. We begin by sewing the side columns together. So we sewed the 10-inch blocks to the 10 by 5-inch blocks. And then we joined these blocks together, and that made the side columns. For the top and bottom rows, we sew a 10-inch block to a 10-inch by 2.5-inch strip. Then sew a 10-inch block and a 5-inch by 2.5-inch strip together and join one of these on either side of the 10-inch blocks. Sew a 10-inch block to either side to complete the top or bottom row. We leave a 1/2 inch of this seam unsewn to facilitate joining the top and the side rows together. Now we need to calculate the size of the Cougar panel and the size of the border that's going to go around the Cougar panel. In order to get these measurements, the side columns and the top and bottom rows need to be ironed. To get the exact measurements we needed, we pinned the side columns and the top and bottom rows together. After our calculations, we cut the border material so that the pattern would be perpendicular to the center Cougar panel. The sides needed to be longer than the width of the material, so we cut some extra pieces, matched the grain, and sewed them together. We only had the one Cougar panel, and the cut had to be exact, so we took extra care and remeasured it again. At this point, everything looks good. We're ready to go. We don't recommend this, but we cut the Cougar panel so that we had 1/16 of an inch of white showing on either side, and then we cut the top and the bottom. Now it's time to sew the border to the Cougar panel. We leave about a 1/2 inch of the seam unsewn in order to fit the corners together. This is what we want the corners to look like when we're finished. Fold one of the edge pieces back on itself, align it with the Cougar panel, and make a crease. This will be the corner where the 2 side pieces come together. This crease mark is a guide. Finish sewing the seam to the crease mark. Use a 45-degree triangle and mark a sewing line from this crease mark. Transfer the intersection of this crease and line to the adjacent border. Mark the other side where the seams of both borders intersect. Use a 45-degree triangle to mark the border on the adjacent side. When this is done correctly, the lines on both sides will match, and you're now ready to sew the borders. Sew along the line. Make sure that all seams around the border have been joined together and completed. The border should look like this. Cut a 1/4 inch away from the seam to remove excess material. Match the center seams of the bottom panel and sew these together. Do the same with the top. Leave a 1/4 inch of this seam unsewn in order to sew the side column seams. Sew the side columns to the Cougar border. Then finish sewing the top and the bottom seams. The center panel section is complete and looks good. Arrange the 5-inch blocks for the next border. Sew the 5-inch blocks for both side columns and the top and bottom rows. Press the seams to get an accurate measurement. Press the seams of the inner panel so that the measurements will be accurate. Our grandson loved this Cougar panel. We are now ready to measure and calculate the material needed for this border. Iron the border material to remove any wrinkles. Cut the material to the width needed for the border. The border needed to be longer than the material, so we added an extension. Pin the side borders to the inner piece. We match the seams. Extend the border material far enough that you can cut it to the correct length. Sew the top and the bottom borders to the intersection and then cut them to the correct length. Sew the side 5-inch block border first on both sides and then sew the top and bottom sections on. We missed this gap when we were sewing this border on, and so we had to unpick the seam and pull a gap together and re-sew it. Sometimes when you're cutting material like this outer border, your cutting guide is not long enough to reach from one end of the material to the other end. For this particular case, I used another ruler alongside of the cutting ruler and just slid the one down to the end of the fabric in order to make this cut. We want the border on the top and the bottom to have the pattern going in the same direction as the side panels, so we had to cut the material across grain. Cut the border material long enough so that it can be cut to length after it's sewn into place. Sew the pieces together to make the top and the bottom border, and then sew the border onto the quilt. Trim the top and bottom borders to match the quilt. Sew the side borders on and cut them to length. The quilt top is now complete, but it needs to be ironed before it is assembled into the quilt. Finally, the quilt top is finished. Iron the underside of the quilt to make sure that there are no wrinkles before you do the assembly. Set up the quilt frame to match the top of the quilt and then clamp it into place. In setting up the quilt frame, make sure that you're able to roll opposite sides as you pin. Place the back of the quilt face down, pin the 4 corners, and then pull the centers between the corners and pin those so that the material is laying flat and straight. The material for the underside of the quilt is larger than the quilt top, so you'll need to pull the edges over the quilting frame and pin them down. The batting goes on next, and it is also larger than the quilt top. Be sure that you pull this so that it's flat and smooth. Does not need to be pinned at this point. We prefer to pin the quilt to the frame while it's on the floor. Thumbtack the corners of the quilt top first, then thumbtack in the center of each side. Be sure that the bottom and the batting and the quilt top are pulled to match. Work from the center of each side and pin it, and then work on the opposite side and pin it until All 4 sides have been pinned. Use bent safety pins to pin the quilt. Pin the quilt about every 4 to 6 inches. When you have finished pinning the quilt, you can remove it from the quilting frame. At this point, I like to trim the excess material off, but I leave enough material that I can do a final trim to the exact size. Now is a good time to review the threads and choose what you're going to use for the top and for the bottom of the quilt. I like to use gloves that grip the fabric. It makes moving it under the sewing machine much easier. We had planned to sew this quilt with free motion quilting, but decided that our skills weren't that good in free motion quilting, and that's why some of the pins are in the wrong place. So we settled with stitch in the ditch. It's best to use the fluff and stuff method to get the quilt through the throat of the sewing machine. Every time you move the material, you need to check to make sure it doesn't get hung up on the edges of the sewing machine. We used free motion quilting around the cougar's face and tried to follow the contour of the clouds and the contour of the trees and the land, and that made the free motion quilting easier. We used the 5-inch blocks in a 45-degree triangle and marked that with chalk, and we feel that made a very nice shape for the outside border. Using a lighter color thread helped make this pattern on the outside border stand out. Now is the time to trim the quilt to the finished size, ready for the binding. We tested some different colors for the binding and decided to stay with the same color as the border. We prefer to pin the binding to the quilt top, matching the rough edges together. We sew the binding with a 1/4 inch seam. When you come to a corner, stop your sewing a 1/4 inch from the outside edge, pull the binding out of the road, and then continue your 1/4 inch seam down the other side. When you have finished sewing the binding to the top side of the quilt, pull the binding to the back side of the quilt and use a hem stitch to stitch it down. Now it's time to go over the quilt and cut off any loose threads. A piece of masking tape will help keep those threads collected. This is the finished quilt. We hope you've enjoyed our presentation. Thank you.